probably recognise this picture as being of Easter Island, which is one of the most remote inhabited islands in the world. It's in the Pacific. It's many hundreds of kilometres from any other island that you can live on. And it has an interesting story. So it was colonised about 800 years ago by Polynesians sailing in wooden dugout canoes eastwards across the Pacific. And when they arrived, it's a small island, about 15 kilometres from one end to the other. It was covered in tropical forests. There were indigenous flightless birds that were good to eat and that were easy to catch. There were seabird colonies with lots of eggs that could be gathered. The soils were rich. The sea around the island was full of fish. And it was a pretty good place to be. So they settled and they started clearing the forests and farming, and they collected the birds' eggs and they caught the flightless birds and ate them. And life was good. The population there, we think, grew to about 15,000 people, and they had sufficient time on their hands to carve these bizarre statues and arrange them around the island. But the island was then rediscovered about 500 years later by European explorers, and when they found it, it was very different. The human population had dropped by about 90%. The few people that were left were starving and had resorted to cannibalism and eating rats to survive. There were no trees left at all. All of the trees that lived on the island had been removed, and some of them were indigenous trees that were now extinct. All of the flightless birds had been eaten. All of the seabirds had stopped nesting there because their eggs were being taken every year. The soil, without trees to hold it together, had washed away, so they couldn't grow crops anymore. And their society had collapsed because they'd used up all the resources. I often wonder, the person who cut down the last tree, given that they needed trees to make boats, to go fishing or to leave, and to build houses and to cook, you wonder what was going through his or her head when he cut down that last tree. Given that it's such a small island, they probably knew it was the last tree, but nonetheless they went ahead and did it. And the relevance of this, I'm sure you can see, but we'll come back to in a moment. So if we look at the world today, not just Easter Island, our wildlife is disappearing. As David Attenborough says here, nature is in trouble. We are losing wildlife at an alarming rate. I'm not quite sure what's happened to the layout of this slide, but the second point there's a report from the World Wildlife Fund which came out 2 years ago, where they estimated how the total number of vertebrates on the planet had changed over time. So vertebrates are mammals, birds, fish, reptiles and amphibians. And they estimated that the total number of what they called animals that we shared the planet with halved between 1970 and 2010. So I was 5 years old in 1970, so in less than my lifetime, the number of animals with which we share this planet halved. I find that an absolutely terrifying calculation. So for countries where we have good data and for groups of wildlife for which are monitored carefully, it's quite clear that these declines are ongoing. Be it birds or butterflies, bees, moths, beetles, they're all disappearing in Britain, in the Netherlands, on a global scale. And the fundamental reason is that we're turning more and more of the land, as I showed earlier, into these huge fields, these monocultures of crops to feed people, monocultures of crops which are repeatedly treated with pesticides and fertilizers and so on, and which leave no space at all for wildlife. If we carry on down this route, as the population grows and as more and more land is cleared to farm in this way, then I fear that there will be very little left in 50 years' time in the way of our wildlife. And I also fear that it's not sustainable in the long term. I don't think this is the way to feed the world. There are other issues which we could address, which would really alleviate the drive for food production. Perhaps the most obvious of which is that we're enormously wasteful. We destroy natural habitats, flower meadows, tropical forests and so on to turn it over to these huge fields of monocultures. And then we throw away 40% of the food that we grow, which is absurd and ridiculous and surely something we can do better about. We also overeat, sorry about the picture, we eat far more than is good for us in the Western world, and people in developing countries are adopting our lifestyles. We eat too much meat, we all know it's true, and we eat just too much. There is a global epidemic of obesity and of diabetes. So not only do we throw away 40% of the food, but of the 60% that's left, some people are eating rather more than is good for them. So there's something else we could do there which would potentially reduce the demand for food. One of the big risks associated with the way we're currently farming is that we're not just losing bees, we're not just losing birds, we're actually losing the soil, which is about the most fundamental thing we have in terms of resources that we need to grow food. There was a recent calculation that we're currently losing the soil from the topsoil, from the surface of the earth, largely because of the way we farm. We're losing about 100 billion tonnes of soil every year. That's 15 tonnes for every person on the planet being lost every year. This is an aerial shot of Madagascar, of a river estuary, and you can see the red soils of Madagascar flowing out to sea. If you plough those soils, as soon as it rains, they just get washed away. It's a particularly bad problem in the tropics, but it's also a problem that's affected European countries. The organic matter content of our soils in Britain is much lower than it used to be. So we're losing, if we lose our soils, what on earth are people going to grow their food in 50 years' time? So what can we do differently to make the world a better place? I don't have all the answers, but I think we really need to look very closely at what we're doing and try and come up with them. I've got some suggestions as to what we might do. So, firstly, there are schemes available already, agri-environment schemes to farmers, where they can get payments to farm in a more environmentally friendly way. For example, by putting in pollen and nectar strips, they're often called, or flower strips, along the edges of their fields. And this is a nice example. These schemes kind of work a little bit. They're a lot better than nothing. We're putting some flowers back into the countryside. But the evidence suggests that this approach alone hasn't really worked. We've been doing it for 20 years or so, and the uptake isn't high enough. The amount of land under these schemes is actually pretty tiny, and our wildlife is disappearing despite them. So it's better than nothing, but it's not going to solve our problems on its own. What else can we do? Well, there's always organic farming. Does that really help? It certainly demonstrates that we can grow food without this barrage of pesticides. On average, organic farms produce about 80% of the yield per hectare of conventional farms, which is pretty good. And if you think about it, that means that if we eliminated food waste, then the entire world could go organic and we could still feed everybody comfortably. Of course, that's really easy to say, but nonetheless, it's food for thought. Now, organic farming has many advantages over conventional farming, but it is far from perfect in itself, and it's still true that if you try to grow big monocultures of crops, be they organic or not, there's not much room for wildlife. You won't have godwits or butterflies or bumblebees living in a field of wheat, no matter whether you put pesticides on it or not. So maybe the organic can help contribute to the mix, but it's perhaps not on its own going to solve the problems. I think we need to be more imaginative if we can. So, for example, there are systems like agroforestry or permaculture where you mix crops up, where you don't have these enormous monocultures in the first place. Part of the problem with big fields, with big monocultures, is that you're trying to create a very unnatural system, a huge area of one type of plant, which is something that would never happen in nature, and it's absolute heaven if you're a pest of that crop. It's much more difficult for pests if you mix the crops up, if you have rows of trees mixed up with, in this case, livestock living between them, but you can plant vegetable crops or fruit bushes or whatever in between them. And it means that the land is never stripped bare by ploughing. You don't get the problems with soil erosion. And this kind of thing is particularly appropriate in tropical countries where they have really bad soil erosion, but where labour is relatively cheap and it's quite possible to grow lots of crops together. In fact, to take it to its smallest scale, This is an allotment in Britain. This is an area owned by gardeners, essentially, with small patches of land, growing food for their own consumption and to share with their friends and so on, mixing up their crops, little tiny patches, and you might think, well, this can't possibly feed the world, but actually it produces amazing amounts of food. You can get about 10 times as much food per hectare of land from this kind of food production compared to huge fields of monocultures where you get just one harvest per year. Here you get all sorts of harvests right through the year, and you can as soon as something's harvested, you can replace it with something else and so on. In Britain, there are 90,000 people on waiting lists to get hold of an allotment so they can grow their own healthy local food, and I do not know why we don't find a way to give them that land. It's not going to feed the world, but it would be a start. And in many developing countries, a lot of food, the food that people actually consume in the country, is grown locally, often within walking distance of cities. The countryside is mostly used for cash crops, which are sold abroad. What people eat is grown much like this very often. So we really could at least contribute to global food production if we went down this route. Finally, a much simpler thing that we can all do is garden, or many people have a garden or have access to some kind of space that they have control over. And we can garden in a more wildlife-friendly way. We can grow flowers for bees and butterflies. There's loads of advice out there as to how you can do that. And even if you've just got a window box in the middle of a city, grow some bee-friendly flowers, and bees will come, they will find it, and they will feed, and you'll be helping them just a little bit. Obviously, if you have a big garden, then you can squeeze in loads of flowers, and you'll have lots of bees, butterflies, and other insects, and so on. Imagine if we could get every garden filled with wildlife-friendly flowers, and we could change the way we often manage council-owned land, like road verges and roundabouts. This is a roundabout sown with wildflowers in Britain. Most of our roundabouts are mown grass. They're mown every couple of weeks. There's not a flower in sight. It doesn't have to be like this. We could try to turn our cities into huge bee nature reserves with flowers in the gardens, the road verges, the roundabouts, the schoolyards, the parks, the playing fields, and so on. So, to finish off from me, this is our Easter Island. We inherited this rock floating in space. It's covered in a thin skin of life, surrounded by the freezing cold vacuum that is space. It's billions of kilometers to anywhere else that might conceivably support us or any other form of life. So we really should be looking after this, and we aren't. We're doing exactly what they did on Easter Island. We are clearing our forests in the tropics, even though we know it's stupid. We're watching our soils wash out to sea. We're watching our birds disappear, our bees disappear, and so on. And we desperately need to find a better way forwards. If we don't, our grandchildren will look back at what we've done to the world and they will weep.